Well, my name's Sebastian Richie, and I'm a historian at the Air Historical Branch of the Royal Air Force. Some years ago, I had to start guiding staff rides, taking groups of officers around the Arnhem area, and it was that really pricked my interest in the conflict. And it seemed to me that there was a lot more to be said about the Arnhem operation, particularly where air power was concerned. I decided that there were really three fundamental myths surrounding the operation, one of which was that the RAF and the USAF, to an extent, essentially failed the airborne forces and the ground forces. Another of which was that Market Garden was a brilliant strategic concept that was ruined by poor low-level tactical planning. And the third was that airborne operations generally can be approached just like any other operation and stand about the same sort of chance of succeeding, whereas it seemed to me, if you looked at the history of airborne operations in the Second World War, you would see very quickly that, in fact, the airborne concept was extremely problematic.
So this operation was really just about tanks, which was the garden part, and the airborne forces, the paratroopers, which was the market part. Put together, that makes Market Garden. Is that just about it?
There's much more to take into account. There is the airborne part of the operation. There is the support of the ground forces that have to be linked up with the airborne. There is the maintenance of air superiority over the battle area, keeping the Luftwaffe at bay as far as possible. There are things like radar cover, resupply for the airborne forces at their deployed locations, and obviously there is the really, really tricky task of running the airlift from a long, long way back. And one of the key problems facing the Allied Air Forces was that the transport aircraft required for the operation were all based back in the UK, some of them in the West Country, and yet they were carrying out an airborne operation some 100 miles or so into enemy-occupied territory and right up to the German frontier. And from an air perspective, that is a very, very difficult thing to do.
One of the problems was that the gliders could not go as fast as the paratroopers in their Dakotas, but they wanted to go across together. So the glider tows would have to go fairly slow, and the Dakotas could probably do 220 knots. They would have to slow right down to 100 knots, so they could only go half their speed. Is that roughly right?
Basically, you had to go broadly at the same sort of speed that the glider combinations fly at. That is the speed at which you are deploying, although the lifts were separate. You would have a glider lift and a parachute lift. But basically, a lot of the timing was dictated by the glider combinations, which were operating at the sort of speed that you would associate with the aircraft of the First World War. So it's the sort of performance envelope that you would associate with a First World War biplane. You're talking something like 120 miles per hour on the way out there, which of course means that you've got very large, unmaneuverable aircraft, and they are flying over a large area of enemy-occupied territory. There are very significant flak deployments in Holland because Bomber Command has been flying over there night after night to get to Germany, and that is a very challenging concept indeed for the Allied Air Forces.
Was it possible to do two lifts in one day? Because they said there was only going to be one lift. That would have meant if they could do two, they could get a whole division into one place on one day.
Yeah, that concept comes from the original idea behind Market Garden, which was the merger of two different operations. One of those operations was an operation called Linnet, which was to have been staged a lot closer to the UK on the French-Belgian border and involved the whole of the 1st Allied Airborne Army. The other operation was an operation called Comet, which was the first small-scale Arnhem operation, and that would have involved only 1st Airborne Division. So the idea behind Market Garden is essentially to merge the airlift for Linnet, which was 2 lifts on the first day, and the scale the objective of Comet. In other words, we are going to do the Linnet operation in terms of scale, but we are going to do it against Arnhem. But that means you have to fly about another 100 miles from the UK. And if you look at the timetable that they actually drew up for Operation Linnet, and you try and make that timetable work with those objectives that are significantly further from Britain, you find that it simply does not work. And this is documented. I mean, you can go back and look at what they were contemplating for Operation Linnet in the National Archives down at Kew. The records are all there. And they could just squeeze those 2 lifts in on day 1, or so they thought, given that the objectives were that bit closer to the UK. With the objectives further afield, at Arnhem and Nijmegen, that simply made it too difficult. The lifts would take too long, the turnaround times back in the UK would take too long, and the chances of getting that second lift in were simply not worth thinking about. Also, I think another point here, if you look at the timetable, it would have required the Arnhem lift to take off a lot earlier than it did. But the records show that many of the airfields in the UK were actually closed by fog at dawn on the 17th of September 1944, and that the aircraft only took off as early as they could, which was in the sort of 9 to 10 o'clock bracket. So the possibility of doing a dawn lift in order to squeeze in a second lift on the first day of the operation was a non-starter. It simply could not have happened, and the operation would have failed at the first hurdle.
And also, there's a lot made of the bad weather. Surely you could just drop in bad weather, you could fly over there, you could navigate, and you could go in bad weather too.
No, you can't do the gliders. Basically, I mean, and even in the lift, as it happened, they lose quite a number of gliders on the first day because the tow ropes break. Basically, in foggy conditions, cloudy conditions, there was a real problem that you had with tow ropes snapping. And consequently, you cannot do it unless it's clear. I mean, the whole thing is very, very inflexible. And one of the great problems with airborne operations is the sheer number of moving parts that you have. If one thing works, then another thing works, and another thing works, and another thing works, and so on. But if just one of those things fails, potentially the whole operation can go wrong. And you see this in airborne operations in the Second World War over and over and over again. Planning and execution could be an absolute nightmare.
Also, to get a bit closer to the objective, why not take off from East Anglia? Most of these aircraft, the glider tows and the Dakotas with the paratroopers, were taking off from places like Wiltshire, many more, probably 100 miles more to the west.
And indeed it would have done. And in fact, at the beginning of September 1944, the commanding officer of 1st Allied Airborne Army, who was an American Lieutenant General called Louis Brereton, actually wrote to Eisenhower suggesting precisely that, or indeed deploying 1st Allied Airborne Army across the Channel to bases on the continent. He was basically arguing that they were too far back, and that they were now likely, we'd broken out from Normandy, we were now likely, if we were going to use airborne forces again, to use them in an operation to take bridges over the River Rhine. And for that purpose, 1st Allied Airborne Army was too far back. So what Brereton argues is, we need to go forward. Preferably, we need to go forward to the continent. But he's making that point at the beginning of September, and by the 10th of September, Market Garden is done and dusted. It's there. It's been approved. It's been rubber stamped. There's just not enough time to do it. So instead, they have to try and stage this operation from much too far back.
Wasn't one of the problems that the two main British generals, Browning, who was in charge of all 3 divisions, and Urquhart, who was the commanding officer of 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, had never worked on airborne operations before? Neither of them had.
Yeah, and that is a problem as well. Urquhart had been brought in to command 1st Airborne Division from outside the Airborne Forces and lacked experience. Browning had much longer experience with the Airborne, but in a much more administrative capacity. He'd not actually led airborne troops into battle. And yet, Browning plays a pivotal part in devising the whole market garden concept. And that really does come close to the crux of the problem, if you like. You've got an officer in a very senior, a very influential position who comes up with a plan that is problematic in almost every single way. And only somebody who lacked that experience, I think, could have produced a plan like that.
What about the failure of the tanks once Nijmegen Bridge had fallen? Why didn't the tanks just drive up to Arnhem? It was only probably 20 minutes drive away and there was nothing to stop them.
It is. I mean, a lot of the airborne veterans have made much of that issue over the years, and I can understand the frustration that they have over that. And a lot of the writers on Market Garden have basically echoed that point. Personally, I don't think perhaps it's as important as people have made out. If you look at the enormous mountain of kit that First Airborne Division took into Arnhem with the airlift that they'd got, it's difficult to see that they were really that short of airlift. That possibly you could look at it another way and say, actually, they are bringing too much kit and possibly too many people. And even with Browning taking those gliders, if 1st Airborne Division had gone in at lighter scales in a single lift, they could have actually put 2 brigades into Arnhem on day one, 2 full brigades. The reason they can't do that is that they have a pre-planned and very inflexible airlift program, which requires them to divide manpower and equipment.
Well, you've got Browning, who was in charge of the operation. Surely, as the commanding officer, he should have gone into where the main objective was, in Arnhem. But he didn't, did he? He went to Nijmegen. It was almost as if he knew that Arnhem was going to be a disaster.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, the whole thing about him going forward, I know that people are very critical of that, but actually that was something that was, and indeed to an extent still is, ingrained in British Army doctrine. A lot of senior commanders to this day like to go forward. And I went on another of these staff rides, in fact, with the ARC headquarters a couple of years ago, and you still hear lots of arguments in favour of the senior commander going forward. But in Browning's case, I can understand why he wanted to do it. As far as not going to Arnhem is concerned, and this was rather the sort of the futility, if you like, of what he did. Obviously, the idea was for him to be in touch with all 3 of the divisions involved in the operation as the commander of 1st Allied Airborne Army for the operation itself. I think that's the reason why he tries to essentially put himself in the middle. But the irony is that the communications don't work anyway, and he has very little success in making contact with the different divisions until some way into the operation.
So ultimately, why do you think the operation went so wrong?
Obviously, people will argue about this one until the cows come home. But my personal view is that they took too many risks. Risks were allowed to accumulate in an uncontrolled way throughout the plan. They were just accepted. But at the same time, the Germans mobilized much more rapidly on a much larger scale than anybody really expected on the Allied side. What you tend to see in the history of Market Garden is people saying if only they'd done that, and if only they'd done this, and if only they'd done the other thing, then everything would have been okay and the operation would have succeeded. In fact, the Germans' ability to mobilize quickly and on that scale means that that argument is fatally flawed, because it assumes that if the Allies had done something differently, the Germans would just have done the same. The fact is that because the Germans do have people in that area, because they can mobilize quickly, if the Allies had changed the way they did the operation, frankly, the Germans would simply have changed their response as well. They had that level of flexibility to do that because they have people in the area and they can respond quickly. And for that reason, I think it is very difficult indeed to devise a plausible idea of how Market Garden might have succeeded.
Why were the tanks not prepared to go to Arnhem?
They had a very heavy fight in Nijmegen, and sometimes the scale of that fight is underestimated. Nijmegen is virtually obliterated by British shelling. We used up huge quantities of ammunition in shelling the place to try and get the Germans out of it. And the British troops who finally pitch up on the other side of the river at the end of that day are exhausted, and their supplies are depleted, and they have no reliable intelligence about what is in front of them. It's a difficult one, and it is one of these old Arnhem issues that people will argue about until the cows come home. But my sense is that a push up from Nijmegen up to Arnhem at that time would probably have been problematic. The number of people who got to Arnhem might have been small. It might have made the difference, but we just don't know.
Also, didn't the Germans know through their intelligence networks they were expecting it? The whole point of an airborne operation is it's supposed to be a surprise, but didn't the Germans know we were coming?
Well, I would tend to agree that issue of surprise was somewhat in question. The Germans, I think that the accurate picture is the Germans were expecting an assault towards Arnhem, but they were not expecting an airborne assault. But because they were expecting an assault towards Arnhem, they had organized their forces into these quick reaction units. And, the worst thing would have been if they'd been expecting an airborne operation. The second worst thing was for them to have organized on that basis where their units in the Arnhem area could respond very quickly. And that's the situation that we were facing. But we just don't take any notice of it. I mean, I know for a fact that the Allies had intercepted a German order effectively mobilizing considerable numbers of home defense troops all along the River Rhine into these quick reaction units. But we simply don't take notice of that. The prevailing view is that the Germans are defeated, or that any troops they can throw into the battle will be of low quality and will be no match for our airborne elite troops, with support of ground forces and air power and so on that we took for granted.
Your book, Arnhem Myths and Realities, is selling for around about £85 second hand. Obviously, there's a big shortage of them. Is it going to be reprinted soon?
Well, I'm hoping that it will come out as a reprint at some stage in the future, but at the moment it's too early to say.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.